It is 1 a.m. on a Wednesday in September 2022, and you are still awake. You don't entirely know why. You told yourself you'd watch for 20 minutes, maybe 30. That was 2 hours ago. Now the tea is cold, the house is completely dark except for the television, and you haven't moved from the sofa in a way that suggests you've forgotten you have a body at all. This is what Westminster Hall does to people, even through a screen, even at 1 in the morning. For those who don't know, and before September 2022, most people outside the United Kingdom didn't fully understand what lying in state actually meant in practice. Westminster Hall is not a church. It is not a cathedral. It is the oldest surviving part of the Palace of Westminster, built in 1097, and its ceiling is a masterpiece of medieval hammer-beam carpentry that has watched over coronations, trials, and the lying-in state of monarchs for centuries. The stone floor is cold. The light is deliberately dim, and in the center of it all, on a raised platform called a catafalque, sat the coffin of Queen Elizabeth II, draped in the royal standard with the imperial state crown resting on top of it, and around it, standing at each corner completely still, a guard. The BBC had been broadcasting this live, continuously, for days. Not highlights, not check-ins, continuously, 24 hours. The kind of television that has no presenter walking around explaining things, no graphics package, no expert panel, just the hall, just the coffin, just the guards. And every few hours, a formal changing of the guard, conducted in absolute silence, with a precision that made you feel like you were watching something that existed outside of normal time. People watched it the way people watch fires, not because something was happening, because something was present. At 1 a.m. on this particular Wednesday, the camera is holding its usual wide shot. 4 guards at the 4 corners of the catafalque. They are members of the household division, the regiments that provide the sovereign's personal protection, and they are dressed in full ceremonial uniform. For some of them on this night, that means the long dark coat and white-plumed helmet of the household cavalry. For others it means bearskin and scarlet. The uniforms weigh more than you'd think. The boots are harder than you'd think. The stillness required is more physically demanding than almost anyone who has never done it could imagine. Standing completely still is not the natural state of the human body. This is something most of us learn at some point, usually at a school play or a long church service, or the first time we stood in a queue for more than an hour. The body wants to shift. It wants to redistribute weight. It wants to bend a knee, rock forward on the heel, unlock the hip. Every soldier who has ever stood ceremonial guard duty knows the techniques, the micro-movements, the controlled breathing, the mental discipline required to hold a position that your own nervous system is constantly trying to abandon. These guards had been doing it for hours. The camera doesn't zoom in. It doesn't need to. The BBC director on duty that night, whoever they were, working the overnight shift in a gallery somewhere, watching a dozen feeds at once, simply holds the shot. Because there is nothing else to show. Because this is the whole story tonight. Westminster Hall at 1 a.m. 4 guards. 1 coffin. Complete silence. And then, if you are watching closely enough, and at this hour, with nothing else in the room making any sound, you are watching very closely. You notice that one of the guards at the foot of the catafalque is not quite right. It is not a dramatic thing. Not yet. It is the kind of wrongness that you register before you can name it, the way you sometimes know a piece of music has gone slightly off-key before you can identify which note. Something in his posture. Something in the quality of his stillness, which is no longer quite the same as the stillness of the others. Where they are like stone, he has become something more fragile, something that is working very hard to remain stone. You lean forward on the sofa. You don't know why. You just do. The BBC presenter. And it is worth saying that presenting the overnight lying-in-state coverage for the BBC is one of the more unusual assignments in broadcasting, requiring you to speak very little, very quietly, and only when something actually happens, had been mid-sentence about the history of the catafalque when he stopped. Not paused, stopped. The kind of stop that happens when a professional person sees something they were not trained to see, and their training kicks in anyway, and the training says, "Be quiet. Wait. Do not make this worse." The guard at the foot of the coffin swayed. It was slow. That is the thing people who saw it live remember most, not that it was fast and shocking, but that it was slow and inevitable, like watching something very tall begin to tip. His knees did not buckle so much as they ceased to insist. His body, which had been held upright by sheer will for hours, simply filed a quiet objection and began to settle toward the floor. He did not fall. That is the important distinction, and it matters more than it might seem. He did not fall the way a person falls when they faint outright, the sudden collapse, the crumple, the sound of impact. He went down with a kind of controlled surrender, as if even in the act of losing consciousness or losing the fight against his own body, some deeply installed part of him was still trying to do it correctly, still trying to do it with dignity, still trying to do it in a way that would not disturb the woman in the coffin 12 inches away from him. His rifle, because the guards carry rifles at slope, the long weapon held diagonally across the body, stayed with him as he went down. He didn't drop it. He went down and he did not drop it. On the BBC, the presenter said nothing. For a full 4 seconds, and 4 seconds of silence on live television is a very long time, long enough that producers in the gallery are already reaching for their headsets, long enough that journalists watching from home are already opening new browser tabs. The presenter said absolutely nothing. Then, very quietly, he said, "It appears one of the guards may have, we're seeing. There appears to be an incident near the catafalque." An incident. That is the word the BBC used, an incident. Which tells you everything you need to know about British broadcasting, and also about the specific, admirable, utterly infuriating British commitment to understatement in moments of genuine crisis. A guard had just folded like a closing book 3 feet from the Queen's coffin, live on national television, in front of what turned out to be hundreds of thousands of overnight viewers. And the BBC called it an incident. The camera did not cut away. This is also important. In the years since, people have debated whether it should have, whether the dignified thing would have been to cut to a wide shot of the exterior of Westminster, to give the man on the floor a moment of privacy. The BBC did not cut away. The BBC kept the camera exactly where it was, and what the camera showed in the 30 seconds that followed was something that turned out to be more compelling than anything a director could have planned. Because out of the shadows, with a composure so complete it seemed almost supernatural, came the response. There are people stationed in Westminster Hall whose entire job during the lying-in state is to watch the guards. Not watch over them in a supervisory sense. Watch them the way a spotter watches a climber with total attention, looking for the precise moment when human endurance reaches its limit, ready to act before the limit becomes a disaster. They stand in the dimness at the edges of the hall in positions that the television cameras largely ignore, and they watch. And they have protocols for exactly this situation. Because this situation, the guard who cannot continue, is not unprecedented. It is, in fact, something that the household division plans for, trains for, has procedures for that are as rehearsed as the changing of the guard itself. What the BBC cameras captured in the 30 seconds after the guard went down was those procedures working exactly as designed. 2 figures moved from the edges of the hall. They did not run. Running in Westminster Hall during the lying-in state of the Queen at 1 a.m. would have been a kind of desecration, not of the Queen, but of the moment, of the gravity, of the 100,000 people who had queued for up to 14 hours in the September cold outside to have their 30 seconds in this room. Running would have meant panic. Running would have meant something was wrong. And the entire point of what happened next was that even though something was wrong, nothing was going to be wrong. Not in this room. Not tonight. They walked. Quickly, but they walked. And in the way they walked, precise, deliberate, the footsteps landing where footsteps were supposed to land, you could see the rehearsal. You could see the hours that had gone into preparing for a moment they hoped would never come. They reached the fallen guard and they did something that struck everyone watching as almost impossibly gentle. They did not grab him. They did not haul him upright with the brisk efficiency of people managing an inconvenience. They supported him. There is a difference, and it was visible on camera, and it mattered. One person took his weight from one side, another from the other, and together they guided him, guided, not carried, not dragged, toward the edge of the hall and through a door that seemed to appear specifically for this purpose, and then closed behind them as if it had never existed. The whole thing took less than 40 seconds. The BBC presenter, to his enormous credit, had recovered his composure by this point. "We can see," he said, in the careful tone of a man narrating something he has not been briefed on, "that a member of the guard has been assisted from his position. We understand this is that there are protocols in place for this eventuality. We wish him well. We wish him well." Again, British broadcasting, an incident, we wish him well. There is a kind of love in that understatement, a refusal to make the man's worst moment into content, a decision made in real time by a professional whose entire career has prepared him for exactly this kind of real-time decision, to say the minimum necessary and let the man keep his dignity. The camera held on the catafalque. The coffin sat exactly as it had sat. The imperial state crown caught the light exactly as it had caught the light. The other three guards stood exactly as they had stood, and where the fourth guard had been, there was now a gap, a space, a corner of the catafalque that had a guard-shaped absence in it. For 90 seconds, and 90 seconds is a long time, long enough to feel the weight of it, long enough for the hall to breathe in and hold it, that corner was empty. The door opened. Not the door the fallen guard had gone through, a different door, and through it, stepping into Westminster Hall with the kind of unhurried precision that suggested he had been standing on the other side of it, ready for some time, came a new guard. He was dressed identically, same uniform, same bearing, same rifle at slope. He walked to the empty corner of the catafalque and he took his position. He stood. He became still. And it was done. The whole thing, the collapse, the assistance, the clearing, the replacement, had taken less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes in a vigil that had been running continuously for 4 days. 3 minutes out of the 96 hours that Westminster Hall had been open, during which an estimated 250,000 people had filed past the coffin. 3 minutes. The BBC presenter exhaled. You could hear it. Not a dramatic exhale, not a sigh of relief, just the involuntary breath of a person whose body has been holding tension it didn't acknowledge and is now releasing it quietly, without fuss, in the British way. "The vigil continues," he said. 3 words, that was the whole sentence. The vigil continues. And it did. The camera held its wide shot. Westminster Hall settled back into its particular quality of silence. 4 guards, 4 corners, 1 coffin, as if the gap had never been there, as if the last 3 minutes had been a test of something that had passed. What is remarkable in retrospect is how little the people queuing outside knew about what had just happened. The queue for the lying-in state, which had at its peak stretched for 5 miles along the south bank of the Thames and required a wait of up to 14 hours, continued through the night exactly as it had before. People shuffled forward in the dark. They reached the front. They were admitted into Westminster Hall. They walked past the coffin in silence. They left. They didn't know, most of them, that something had happened. The vigil had protected them from knowing. The machine had absorbed the disruption so completely that the people the machine existed to serve never felt it. That is an extraordinary thing to do. Not dramatic, not cinematic in any conventional sense. No one fought anything off. No one made a speech. No one was heroic in the way movies teach you to recognize heroism. But something was protected that night with a totality that is genuinely difficult to achieve. The sense that the institution was bigger than any individual within it, that the ceremony was more permanent than any single moment of human frailty, that the duty to the woman in the coffin was so deep and so genuine that it could accommodate even the moment when a man's body said enough and answered that with, "Not yet." The internet, of course, was doing what the internet does. Across social media, within minutes of it happening, people were clipping the footage, sharing it, watching it again and again. Not to mock. That is the part that surprised some observers who perhaps expected the worst. Not to ridicule or shame, to feel something. To sit with the strangeness and the solemnity of having watched a human body fail in the most public, most dignified, most historically weighted way imaginable, and then watched the system that human body was part of simply close the gap and continue. By 2 a.m., it was trending in the United Kingdom. By 3 a.m., it was trending in 12 countries. And by morning, people wanted to know who he was. His name came out gradually, the way these things do, not through any official announcement, because the Ministry of Defense does not typically issue press releases about individual soldiers who collapse during ceremonial duty, but through the kind of careful, investigative piecing together that journalists do when the public has decided it needs to know something. He was a young soldier, a member of the household division. He had been standing for hours in full ceremonial dress, a uniform that is not designed for comfort, that is designed for appearance, for the projection of permanence and solemnity, and that achieves both those things at significant cost to the person wearing it. The bearskin alone, the tall black fur cap that is the most recognizable element of the Queen's Guard uniform, weighs approximately 1.5 pounds and sits on the head like a small, hot, immovable structure. The tunic is thick wool. The boots are rigid leather. The whole ensemble, in the warmth of Westminster Hall, which was kept at a temperature that balanced the comfort of the public queuing through it against the preservation requirements of what lay at its center, is genuinely punishing to wear for extended periods. Add to that the emotional weight. This is the thing that gets discussed less, because it is harder to quantify, but it matters. These were not strangers guarding a stranger. Many of the soldiers who stood vigil over the Queen's coffin had served in regiments with direct royal connections. Some had met her. All of them had trained under an institution she had been the head of for 70 years. The woman in the coffin was not simply a symbolic head of state to them. She was, in a very real and specific military sense, their commander-in-chief. They were grieving. They were standing guard over their grief while experiencing it. And they were doing it in front of cameras, in front of a nation, in front of the world. The young soldier who went down that night had been holding all of that, the weight of the uniform, the heat of the hall, the hours of stillness, the grief, the duty, the knowledge that hundreds of thousands of people were watching, and he had held it for as long as his body would allow. And when his body stopped allowing it, he went down in a way that, somehow, even in the going down, retained something of what he'd been standing there to represent. He did not drop the rifle. People kept coming back to that. In the social media discussions, in the newspaper columns, in the conversations people had over breakfast the next morning, that detail kept surfacing. He did not drop the rifle. His body was in the process of losing a battle it had been fighting for hours, and he still did not drop the rifle. There is something in that, something about the depth to which training can go, the level at which discipline can be installed in a person, the place where a soldier's body learns a thing so thoroughly that even unconsciousness cannot fully reach it. The Ministry of Defense confirmed in a brief statement that the soldier had received medical attention and was recovering. They did not name him. They did not elaborate. The statement was 9 words long. It was, again, exactly as British as everything else about this story. What the statement didn't say, what nobody official said, because nobody official says these things, because the entire culture operates on the assumption that such things are understood rather than stated. Was that what happened in Westminster Hall that night was not a failure? It looked like one. For 30 seconds in real time, it looked like one. A man's body failing in the most public way imaginable, on the most watched broadcast in the country, in front of the coffin of the most famous woman in the world. But it wasn't. Because a failure would have been the gap staying empty. A failure would have been the response being panicked or clumsy or slow. A failure would have been the vigil interrupted, the ceremony broken, the coffin left unattended even for a moment. None of those things happened. The gap closed. The vigil continued. The institution held. What happened instead was something rarer and stranger and more moving than a display of perfect human capability. What happened was a display of a system, built over centuries, refined over generations, staffed by people who trained for years to be ready for moments they hope never come, working exactly as it was designed to work, accommodating human frailty, planning for it, holding the space open so that when the frailty arrived, as it always does, as it always must, it did not become catastrophe. It became something that could be helped out a side door with gentleness and replaced within 90 seconds, and the coffin would still be attended, and the vigil would still continue, and the hundreds of thousands of people who had stood in the cold for 14 hours to have their 30 seconds in that room would have their 30 seconds undisturbed. There is a word for what that is. Several words, actually, depending on which tradition you're drawing from. In the language of institutions, it is called redundancy, the building in of backup capacity so that no single failure can bring down the whole. In the language of military training, it is called preparation. In the language of the people who watched it that night, texting each other and posting clips and sitting alone on sofas in the dark, it was called something simpler. It was called they were ready. They were ready for this. They were ready for him. They had a door and a protocol and a replacement and a procedure for guiding a man out with dignity intact, and they had it because someone, at some point in the long history of this institution, had thought, what happens when a person cannot continue? And had answered that question not by deciding it would never happen, but by deciding that when it did, it would be handled. It would be absorbed. It would not become the story. Except that it did become the story. Because this is the thing about moments of genuine human dignity. They do not stay quiet. You can handle them correctly, privately, with understatement and protocol and 9-word press releases. And they will still find their way out into the world, and people will still watch the clip again and again at 2 a.m. and feel something they cannot quite name. What they are feeling probably is this. A person tried to hold something sacred together with their own body. They held it for as long as they could. When they couldn't hold it anymore, the people around them held it instead. And then, when he was safe, when he was out the side door and in the care of whoever was waiting for him there, the thing he had been holding was still standing. Undisturbed. Continuous. Exactly as it had been before he went down. That is not a failure. That is not even close to a failure. The queue outside Westminster Hall that night stretched 5 miles. People in sleeping bags and folding chairs and borrowed coats, shuffling forward in the dark, waiting their turn. They did not know what had happened inside. The vigil had protected them from knowing. By the time most of them filed past the coffin, the gap had long since closed. The new guard had long since found his stillness, and Westminster Hall looked exactly as it had looked for 4 days, timeless, dim, cold, and permanent. But somewhere in the building or in a car on the way to wherever he was going to recover, the young soldier who did not drop his rifle was being looked after, by people who had prepared for this, by an institution that had decided long before September 2022 that when a person's body gives out in service of something larger than themselves, the correct response is not to make it worse. The correct response is to catch them, guide them, get them through the door, make sure they're all right. And then close the gap. And continue. The vigil continues. It always does.